Hello, class. In this first lecture for the course, for Module 1, the context of the New Testament, I want to address the question of the Jewish apocalyptic context. When I talk about the Jewish apocalyptic context, I want to emphasize that I'm talking about the primary theological context in which we will be reading the New Testament throughout this course this summer. And I want to provide a theological framework for you understanding our readings of the biblical texts as well as our readings from the different scholars that we will be looking at this semester as we look at the different biblical books. It's important to understand that the world of the New Testament is not a single world that is just defined in a vacuum, where and the scripture is written kind of without any historical context or theological context, but that the scriptures, the New Testament was written and was meant to be interpreted in light of a particular theological context. And when I say theological context, I mean the New Testament writers, as Jews, expected God to do something. They saw God in a certain way. They learned of God acting in a certain way from the Jewish scriptures, and they anticipated God acting in that way in the future. And so in light of this theological context that had arisen among the people of Israel, the New Testament texts were written to give witness to Jesus Christ, who they understood to be the apocalypse or revelation of God. And so I want to spend a few minutes just briefly talking about the Jewish apocalyptic context. The immediate context of early Christianity and of the early Christian disciples in the New Testament is what is known as post-exilic Israel. In other words, in the late 6th century BC, the people of Israel had been driven out of their homeland and into exile by foreign political powers. This had created a scattering of the Jewish people across the land of Israel, but also other foreign lands, and had actually put the Jewish faith itself into question. So for 600, 700 years, the Jewish people lived in a context where they had no real central identity geographically. And so they had to develop a way of surviving as the Jewish people in light of political threats that were coming at them from other kingdoms and other political powers in the world. And it was out of this context that there arose what we call today in New Testament studies and in theology what is called apocalyptic eschatology, or sometimes Jewish apocalyptic. And apocalyptic eschatology is really just a fancy term. We'll see this at certain points in our readings, especially when we look at Romans and the theology of Paul, but also in Mark. Apocalyptic eschatology is just a fancy term to say that they expected the end of God's purpose to culminate in a revelation, which is just what the word apocalypse means, a revelation of God in which God would show God's power, God would show God's faithfulness to the people of Israel, and God would restore to Israel the promise that God had given Abraham, that this should be the people through which God would redeem creation and bring about the redemption of the world. So Jewish apocalyptic thought initially emerged in the prophetic writings of the Old Testament, particularly those writings that occurred after the late 6th century BC in this situation of exile for the Jewish people. So we see the prophets Daniel, the prophet Isaiah, the prophet Ezekiel, three of the most important prophets among those who started to develop this idea of Jewish apocalyptic. And really what is meant by developing Jewish apocalyptic is basically to say that these prophets in post-exile Israel developed the hope of a new act of God in which a new creation would be revealed. In other words, Jewish apocalyptic was a way of saying, if there is any hope for us, and if there is any hope for this world, God must act towards us in such a way that a new creation is brought about. And so a lot of times we hear of the prophets of the Old Testament, especially prophets like Daniel, like Ezekiel, talking about the judgment of God. But not only did they speak of the judgment of God, they spoke of primarily the hope of God. God's judgment for the Old Testament prophets did not mean that God was giving up on the covenant that he had made with Israel. Instead, God's judgment that God's judgment meant that the covenant was going to be fulfilled based on God doing something absolutely new in the world. God's judgment, in other words, is another way of saying that if God reigns, if this world is to be the place of God's kingdom, then we must decisively look to the future and ask how God's purposes, established in the covenant with Israel, will triumph. And so it's from this orientation toward the future that the genre of Jewish apocalyptic writing emerged. And Jewish apocalyptic writing is just a way of saying that the prophets pronounced God's judgment upon the people of Israel for their unfaithfulness. But at the same time, they proclaimed this hope that in the future, the earthly conditions of the world as we know it will come to an end, and the full manifestation of the kingdom of God or the reign of God will be established in a king through the lineage of David, who will finally mediate God's holiness and God's glory perfectly, and thus because the perfect king and perfectly God, the perfect priest. And we'll see this in the New Testament. Jesus is seen as king, but he's also seen as the perfect priest as well, from a Jewish context. So when you read the New Testament, I want you to keep in mind that this is the primary setting that is being taken into context as these writers are writing. Much of the New Testament is written from the perspective of this Jewish apocalyptic outlook. And so I want to talk about 5 key marks of Jewish apocalyptic writing in the Old Testament. And we'll see how these are present throughout the New Testament as we study it this semester. 1, Jewish apocalyptic is marked by a battle between God's people, or God himself, or God's self, and the enslaving and oppressive powers of the world, which contradict God's purpose of holiness for the creation. These powers are the powers of sin and death. Isaiah 25:8, for example, speaks of the day when God will swallow up death forever. In other words, the first mark of Jewish apocalyptic is that the prophets and the Jewish people expected from God a work in which death and the powers that brought death in this world, the political powers that had put the Jewish people in exile, that had driven them from their homes, that these powers would be put to an end and put to death, and in being put to end and being put to death, that sin and death itself would be put at an end. So that's the first mark of Jewish apocalyptic. The second mark of Jewish apocalyptic is that this event would involve a necessarily invasive action of God because of the enslaved condition of the world. In Isaiah 64, Isaiah calls for the heavens to be rent open, or calls upon God to rend the heavens and come down. And this is really the image that a lot of Jewish prophetic writers used, was that God was going to come down and come into this world, because this world had become so sinful and the political powers of this world had become so corrupt, and religion itself had become so corrupt that the world had closed in on itself. And in order for the world to be opened up to something new, God must come to the world from the outside. So one, God is going to act to put an end to the powers of sin and death. But two, God is going to do that by acting from the outside, by doing a new thing from beyond this world. That action is, and this is the third mark of Jewish apocalyptic, that action is primarily an action of judgment. Israel and the nations. Israel is among the nations, and the whole creation has failed to live up to the measure of God's holiness, has failed to live up to the covenant that God made with Israel, and because of Israel's failure to live up with the covenant that God made with Israel, the rest of the nations themselves have been compromised in God's purpose. And as a result of this, God will bring judgment upon the people of Israel, and through the people of Israel upon the whole of the world. And so Isaiah in 24, verses 21 and 22 speaks of a day when God will punish the host of heaven and the kings of the earth on earth. In other words, God will punish those who have come before and who have failed to live up to the covenant, but God will also punish those political powers of the day that are holding people in bondage and that are keeping back the kind of faithfulness that would allow for this promise, this covenant to be fulfilled. And so God's action is an action of judgment, but fourthly, God's action is depicted as final. What happens will be a decisive, unsurpassable, and unsurpassed action of God. It will be the ultimate establishment of a new and final standard, or perhaps a better way to put it, new covenant of God with God's people. And this covenant will be the final covenant. This covenant will be the covenant that defines God's relationship to the world for the rest not only of history, but defines God's relationship to the world for all of eternity. And so Jeremiah 31, for example, Jeremiah, one of the most important prophetic writers when it comes to Jewish apocalyptic, wrote of God establishing a new covenant through the coming of a Messiah or a new king. The fifth point of Jewish apocalyptic that I want to emphasize is that God's action is cosmic or universal in scope. When I say cosmic, I mean the hope is not just a hope for the Jewish people. The hope is not just the hope for the people of Israel. The hope is not just a hope for the nations that have enslaved the people of Israel. The hope is a hope for a brand new creation. One in which, through Israel, all flesh, to use the word from Isaiah 66:23, all flesh will finally be led to worship God in an everlasting new creation. So this is Jewish apocalyptic theology. This is what the New Testament writers expected when they were reflecting. First of all, this is what the people of the New Testament at the time of Jesus expected when Jesus came into the world and was interpreted by certain Jews as the Messiah. But this is also what the New Testament writers were thinking and how they were interpreting the event of Jesus when they wrote the New Testament in the Gospels and then the letters to the churches. They were writing out of this apocalyptic context. And so the importance of the Jewish apocalyptic context for the New Testament and for reading the New Testament is that the New Testament authors were convinced that God's action to bring about a new creation, God's action to bring judgment upon the nations, God's action to bring judgment upon the world of sin and death and to bring an end to that sin and death, God's invasion into the world from the outside, God's final act had occurred in the life and in the death and in the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth was what you could say the apocalyptic Messiah. Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of Man, as Mark refers to him, the Son of Man who reveals God's reign of peace, God's reign of justice, and God's reign of love, as opposed to the kingdoms of violence, injustice, and hatred that rule this world. And so when we look at the New Testament and the Jewish apocalyptic context of the New Testament, I want us to think of the New Testament first and foremost in this course as a witness to the way in which Jesus Christ is this apocalyptic act of God, the revelation of God to bring about the end of the powers of sin and death in this world and to bring about the new creation. If you can get that theological context, I think you'll understand a little bit more of what's happening in the New Testament. Because a lot of the players in the New Testament are players that are caught up in this game of political oppression in which the Jewish people still find themselves extremely oppressed. Right? And so at this time, especially when the New Testament when the New Testament events were occurring in the first century, and then when the New Testament was written in the late first century and early second century, when those books were being written, the context here was one in which Rome had come to rule the world with an iron fist, if you will, one that had basically brought extreme turmoil upon the Jewish people. Jewish people were dying daily to the point that the Jews were trying to figure out a way to survive. You'll see Jesus in constant struggle with certain Jewish groups in the New Testament. The Pharisees, for example, who were very committed to the religious law and thought that salvation would come through obedience to the law or adherence to the law. The Sadducees, who, though they were adherents of the law as well, thought that the hope for the Jewish people was in some kind of political alliance with the earthly powers, some kind of political alliance with Rome. You see these Jewish leaders and the leaders of Rome, Caesar and the high priest, working together to establish alliances. And what we'll find throughout the New Testament is those alliances are not accepted by Jesus. They are not accepted by the followers of Jesus, but rather they're called into question. Because what they say is, no, those alliances are powerful political alliances that just continue the oppression of the Jewish people and other peoples of the nations that had begun in Jewish exile. And so, if we're going to continue to be faithful to God, something new has to happen, a new reality, a new creation has to happen that can't just be aligned with the political powers of this world, that can't just be a compromise with Rome, that cannot just be a compromise with Herod or with the high priest or with Caesar, but rather instead, or even with the emperor himself, but rather instead must be one in which a new creation, a new world is established. That is Jewish apocalyptic, and that is the theological context in which Jesus emerges as the Messiah for for Jewish people in the early first century, and that is the context out of which the New Testament is written. So as you go forward, keep that in mind as we look at this the books of the New Testament, this course, because as you will see, you'll see so many aspects of that Jewish apocalyptic at work in these writings, and we'll be studying that. But I wanted to go ahead and give you that background, and hope as we begin to read the New Testament that you see it through that theological lens.